Usually, the stories sent to me are recollections of terrifying and disturbing events. What you're about to hear is instead an archive of research and sightings of something that should not exist. Data compiled on the same creature going back decades. Whatever it is, it hunts and lives in Yellowstone National Park, and it seems to enjoy watching humans from afar, and sometimes very, very close. This story is titled The Werewolves of Yellowstone and was sent to me by The Logical One. My name is Mac, and yes, unfortunately, that is short for Mackenzie. I'm 61 years old. I spent 32 years with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the last 14 in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I retired in 2019 with a GS-12 pension, a bad left knee, and a filing cabinet in my garage that my wife thinks contains old elk survey data. It does not, in fact, contain old elk survey data. What follows is a compilation of testimony, field notes, and personal observations spanning 20 years, from 2004 through 2024, concerning what I have referred to in my own documentation as an unclassified, large bipedal canid observed in and around Yellowstone National Park. I typed that phrase for the first time in 2006 on an FWS form 3-202B, the Wildlife Incident Supplement, and I remember staring at it on the screen for a while before I hit print. I use that language because it gives me something to hold on to. It sounds like science. It sounds like something with a place in a taxonomy, something that could be described, classified, and filed. Without that language, I'd have to use the word that my witnesses keep using, and I'm not ready to put that word on the first page. You'll hear it soon enough. Allow me to be forward with you about what I am and what I'm not. I have a master's degree in wildlife biology from Montana State. I've published 9 peer-reviewed papers regarding certain migration corridors in the GYE. I've sat in congressional subcommittee hearings as a technical advisor on gray wolf reintroduction. All of that to say that I'm not a cryptozoologist. I don't attend those conferences like Paracon or Cryptid Fest or whatever. Never owned a TV show or been on one, and I don't have a podcast. Until this document, I've never presented these findings to anyone outside of a small group of colleagues who I trust and who have asked me not to use their names. I began collecting these accounts because they kept crossing my desk in forms that didn't fit. Wildlife encounter reports where the animal described was not a bear, or a wolf, or a moose, or a mountain lion, and it sure as hell wasn't a person. The early ones I filed and forgot. The later ones I filed and didn't forget. The witnesses were, more often than not, people whose professional judgment I had relied on for years. Seasonal rangers, wolf biologists, backcountry trail crew, maintenance workers who'd spent more time in the Yellowstone interior than most researchers ever will. My criteria for inclusion were strict because they had to be. If I was going to keep a shadow filing cabinet in my garage for 20 years, the material inside it had better be solid. The witness had to be sober, they had to have filed an official report, or agreed to a recorded interview on my Olympus WS-853, which I bought in 2009 and still use. The account had to include specific physical details inconsistent with known North American megafauna. I excluded anything that sounded borrowed from Bigfoot mythology, anything I suspected was invented for attention, and any accounts from Native American spiritual or ceremonial contexts. This last exclusion deserves a word of explanation, because several people I spoke with from the Shoshone and Crow nations made it clear to me that what they know about these things operates on a level I'm not qualified to address. Their knowledge is older than mine and governed by different rules. I'm a biologist. I measure tracks and interview witnesses. That's my lane, and I've tried to stay in it. Overall, 41 accounts met my criteria. I will present a representative selection here, followed by my own experience, which occurred on September 14, 2022, in the Pelican Valley region of Yellowstone's backcountry, after which I had trouble sleeping for many months. I want to add one more thing before we begin. I know how these reports can sound. After all, I've sat across a table from a woman with a PhD in wildlife ecology who told me she watched a wolf stand up and run on two legs alongside her car at 45 miles per hour. I know what that sounds like coming from someone's mouth, but I also know what her face looked like when she said it. She gripped her coffee mug with both hands the entire time, and her voice was careful and flat. She would rather have swallowed glass than say those words to another professional. I'm writing this for her, and people like her. For Gary Wint, and for the Marine who wouldn't give me his name, and for every other person in these files who saw something that they'll spend the rest of their lives wishing they hadn't. They told me the truth, so I wrote it down, and I'm giving that truth to you. The Early Reports, 2004 through 2010. Account 3. In June of 2004, a wolf researcher I'll call Dr. Carla Bryce was monitoring the Druid Peak Pack in the Lamar Valley via radio telemetry. It was 4:40 a.m. The sky was blue-gray, that time of the morning when everything is visible, but nothing has full color yet. Carla was alone in her vehicle with a thermos of burnt government coffee and a Swarovski spotting scope on a window mount. She preferred to work alone. Most of the good ones do. She picked up movement on a ridgeline approximately 800 meters east of her position and trained the scope on it. She observed what she initially identified as a gray wolf, possibly injured, moving along the ridge with abnormal posture. The animal appeared to be walking upright on hind legs, its forelegs hanging at its sides. Her first assumption was a spinal injury. Wolves with severe spinal trauma can sometimes attempt to walk in a semi-upright position, though they can rarely sustain it for more than a few steps. Carla watched this animal walk upright for approximately 90 seconds. Then it dropped to all fours and moved into the timber at a speed she described in our interview 7 years later as faster than any wolf I've tracked in 11 years of fieldwork. I asked her to put a number on it, but she wouldn't. She said the closest comparison would be a wolf in a full chase sprint after elk, but that the gait was different. Longer strides. The body was too low to the ground, she said, like a dog that's been trained to run under fences. Carla filed her original observation as a report of an injured wolf, Form 3-202B, and noted the GPS coordinates and approximate time. Standard procedure. What she didn't include in that report, and what she only told me over drinks in Bozeman in 2011, was the part that happened between the walking and the running. The animal stopped at the tree line. It turned its head and looked directly at her scope. At her position, she was more than 800 yards away and downwind in a closed vehicle. I asked her how she could be sure if it was looking at her specifically and not just scanning in her general direction, just like any alert animal will do. She shook her head once. I could feel it, she said. It knew exactly where I was. It looked at me, like someone recognizing me in a parking lot. 5 years later, I would have written that kind of statement off as the embellishment that sometimes creeps into memory after the fact. It's simply human nature to reshape experiences. People might add meaning retroactively. I know this because I spent a career interviewing witnesses about wildlife encounters and learning to filter the signal from the noise. But by 2011, I had 14 accounts in my filing cabinet, and the noise was starting to sound a lot like a signal. Account 9. In August of 2007, I drove out to a backcountry campsite near Shoshone Lake with 2 trail crew members who had reported an unusual wildlife encounter 3 days prior. I won't use their names because neither gave me permission, so I'll call them what I called them in my notes: the Marine and his partner. They had camped at an authorized backcountry site, and something had circled their camp for approximately 3 hours between 1 and 4 a.m. The Marine was clear about the footfalls, 2-legged. He said he grew up hunting whitetail in Wisconsin and had heard every kind of animal walk through the woods at night. This was a biped. Big footsteps and sustained circles around the campsite at a distance of maybe 40 or 50 feet, looping around and around for 3 hours, and a pattern that never varied. I asked him about bears. Bears will investigate a campsite, but their movement is investigatory. They'll approach, sniff, rummage, and leave. They don't walk in circles, though. He knew this. He told me he'd worked bear closures in Glacier before transferring to Yellowstone, and he said, very quietly, with his hands folded on the picnic table in front of him, steady and careful, "Mac, that wasn't a bear." We hiked out to the site and I examined the tracks. The soil was soft enough to hold good impressions. What I found was a canid track pattern. It had 4 toes, claw marks, consistent with wolf or large dog, but approximately 7 inches across, nearly double the width of a large male gray wolf print. More troubling was the stride. These tracks showed sustained bipedal movement. Left, right, in a repeating circle around the campsite. I recorded everything. I measured the depth of impression, and I documented the stride length. Of course, none of this proves anything definitive. Tracks in soft soil can be distorted by moisture, temperature, and the weight distribution of the animal. But let me tell you about how the tracks ended. This is the part I still think about, when I should be thinking about other things. The tracks led to the lake shore, Shoshone Lake, which is the largest backcountry lake in Yellowstone. No road access or motorized boats, and the water temperature in August ran around 50 degrees. The bipedal tracks walked in a straight line to the water's edge, and they ended there. I didn't see them curve to the left or right, and they had not reversed on me. The last clear print was approximately 6 inches from the waterline, oriented straight ahead toward the lake. Whatever made those tracks walked into Shoshone Lake, and as far as I could determine from 2 hours of searching the perimeter, did not come out. Account 14. Gary Wint was a 58-year-old plumber. He had worked for the National Park Service in Yellowstone for 26 years. He was driving an authorized government vehicle on the Park Road, near Tower Junction at approximately 11 p.m. on a night in October of 2010. He was returning from an emergency call at Roosevelt Lodge, where a pipe had burst in the kitchen. And he had the road to himself. The park was weeks from winter closure, and the tourist traffic was gone. Something was standing in the road. Gary told me it was on 2 legs. He said 6.5, maybe 7 feet tall, gray-brown, heavy across the shoulders and chest. It was facing away from him, and when his headlights hit it, the animal turned its head and looked at the truck. Gary told me the face was a wolf's face on a man's neck, and I mean exactly that. He said the muzzle, the ears, the shape of the skull were all wolf, but the neck was long and thick, and the head sat on top of the body instead of in front of it. The posture was vertical, upright, the way you and I stand. It looked at his truck for maybe 2 seconds, then stepped off the road. 1 big stride is all it took. Gary said the legs bent wrong, that the knee appeared to hinge in the right direction, but the proportions were wrong. The femur was too long or the shin was too short, and the single step it took to clear the road covered a distance of what he estimated at about 8 feet. Then it was in the dark, and Gary was alone on the road. I sat across from him in a booth at the Wonderland Cafe in Gardiner, Montana, 6 weeks after the incident. He had ordered the rancher's breakfast, 3 eggs, bacon, hash browns, and toast, and I watched him touch none of it. His fork stayed on the napkin. He told me what he saw and his voice stayed level the whole time, but I noticed a quality to it, which I'd heard from other witnesses and would hear again many times over the years: precision. He wanted to be clear and straight, to desperately be believed, because what he saw was bizarre. "I know what I saw," Gary said to me, "and I wish I never did." He retired the following spring, 26 years of service, full pension, good record, could have worked another 7 years to max out his benefits. When I asked why he was leaving, he looked out the window toward the park. The north entrance arch was visible at the end of the street, that big stone arch with the Roosevelt quote, and beyond it the road winding south into Gardner Canyon, into the country where Gary had crawled under frozen pipes for more than half his adult life. "I can't do these night calls anymore," he said. "I just can't." I get it. But I didn't say that, because at that point I was still pretending I was just collecting data. Just a biologist with an unusual side interest. A man with his filing cabinet. But I got it. And when I got in my truck that afternoon to drive home, I locked my doors before I started the engine, which was something I never consciously did before. Not in 30 years of driving government vehicles through grizzly country. I wanted to tell myself it was an accident of my hand, or a reflex. Nothing to get upset over. I told myself that all the way home. By 2012, I had 20 accounts in my files. I started doing something I probably should have done earlier. I read them all back to back in chronological order in a single sitting. I spread the transcripts and data across my kitchen table, and I read for 3 hours. When I was done, I sat there for a while longer, because the accounts were telling me something I hadn't wanted to hear. They were wildly, unreasonably consistent. 20 people spanning 8 years, most of whom had never met each other, were describing the same animal. If these were fabrications or misidentifications, you would expect noise and variation, drift that happens when people are confusing bears with shadows. Instead, I had 20 accounts that read like 20 observations of a single species. And that was the afternoon I stopped pretending it was just a hobby. Let me tell you what the reports describe, taken as a body of evidence. I'll try to stay in the clinical register here, because this is the section that needs it most. The moment I let myself editorialize about this material is the moment it stops being useful. Witnesses consistently describe an animal between 6 and 8 feet tall when standing upright. When on all fours, the body is comparable to a very large gray wolf, but with proportions that every single witness characterizes in one way or another as simply wrong. They'll describe the torso as long or the limbs as heavy, the head being too large. Several witnesses compared the overall impression to a wolf that had been stretched out, or to a person wearing a wolf's body who doesn't quite know how the joints are supposed to work. The animal is capable of both quadrupedal and bipedal movement. 12 of my 41 witnesses report seeing the creature transition between the two, and every one of them struggles to describe it. The word that comes up most often is fluid, followed closely by, of course, wrong. These two words don't go together in normal English. Things that are fluid are graceful, not wrong, and things that are wrong are clumsy, not fluid. But the witnesses keep reaching for both words at once, as if the movement they saw was smooth and terrible at the same time. One ranger, a man with 15 years of backcountry patrol experience, told me, "It moved like water running uphill. It was beautiful, and it should not have been happening." The bipedal gait is the single most common element across all 41 accounts. Bears stand upright, everyone knows this, but a bear on its hind legs is a bear doing something temporary and uncomfortable for it. It sways, it lumbers, its forelimbs hang in such a way that communicates how much it would like to put them back down. What my witnesses describe instead is an animal that walks on 2 legs, like you and I. Easy balance, as if the body is made for it. Several witnesses used the same phrase without any prompting from me. They said it walked like it knew where it was going. Nearly every nighttime witness comments on the eye shine. This is where the reports get harder to reconcile with known biology. Canid eye shine is typically green-gold. Bear eye shine tends toward amber or reddish. What my witnesses describe is a flat, pale reflectivity in a color that nobody can pin down. White is the most common descriptor. Silver is a close second. One witness said, like headlights bouncing off a mirror. Another said, like looking at the moon in a puddle. A backcountry ranger who had spent 6 years doing nighttime wolf telemetry told me the eye shine was the color of nothing, which I wrote down and have never known what to do with. I should tell you that I've spent my career looking into the eyes of large animals. I've actually been charged by grizzlies twice. On another occasion, I was treed by a cow moose protecting a calf near Slough Creek in 2003. I once held eye contact with a mountain lion for what felt like an hour, but honestly it was probably 40 seconds. That happened on a trail above Hell-Roaring Creek, close enough I could see the dust on its whiskers. None of these experiences prepared me for what I saw in Pelican Valley in September 2022, and when I get to that part of this account, I'll try to explain why. But I'm not there yet, and I find myself grateful that I don't have to recount it so soon. This is the part that changed the way I lock my doors at night. In none of my 41 reports did the creature make aggressive physical contact with the witness. It has not, as far as I know, attacked anyone. And yet, in 23 of those 41 reports, the witnesses described the overwhelming impression of being specifically observed, tracked, selected. They used different language for it, but the feeling was the same. The sense that whatever they were looking at was also looking at them, and had been looking at them for longer than they'd been looking at it. I called this directed attention behavior in my notes. I had to have a name for it, and naming something is how a scientist creates the illusion of understanding, and it has the extra effect of making it feel smaller. It doesn't actually make things smaller, it just makes it less scary. What my witnesses described is an animal that watches specific humans with what I can only call intention, and the word intention implies cognition, and cognition at this level implies an intelligence I'm not comfortable assigning to something with a 7-inch canid paw print. But the alternative is that 23 people, independently across 18 years, all invented the same feeling, and I find that harder to believe. Approximately half my witnesses reported a strong, distinctive odor associated with the encounter. This is worth noting because it's specific in a way that fabricated details rarely are. People who make up monster sightings don't usually invent smells. The odor was described most commonly as copper and rot. Imagine a metallic, organic reek. Several of the witnesses compared it to old blood. One trail worker said it smelled like a freezer that lost power for a week, and another said it reminded him of the rendering plant outside his hometown in Nebraska, where animal carcasses were processed into industrial grease. I include these details because they're ugly and specific, and those things are the fingerprint of truth. I should confess something here. In 2006, 2 years into this project, I was hiking alone on a trail in Hayden Valley. Late afternoon, September, overcast. I caught a smell that stopped me in the trail. Copper and wet rot. It was very close and strong. My immediate assumption was an elk carcass. I stood in the trail and looked into the timber on both sides, and I thought about going in to find the source. I mean, documenting predator kills was part of my job. But I didn't go in. I told myself the light was fading, and I was alone out here. The smartest move would be to come back with a partner. All of that was true, but I can tell you now that the real reason was simpler. That smell scared the hell out of me. I've smelled hundreds of dead animals in my career, from day-old fawn kills to month-old bison carcasses bloating in July heat. This was completely different. The smell was like something alive, and yet it smelled like death. And that distinction made every hair on my forearms stand up. I turned around then and walked back briskly to the trailhead, and by briskly I really mean barely south of running. I told myself it was a carcass, and I wanted to believe that for over a decade. The majority of encounters in my files were silent, which is in itself remarkable. An animal of this size moving through forest would produce quite a bit of noise. Many witnesses, though, said the silence of the encounter was the most disturbing element. In 3 accounts, witnesses reported a vocalization. One called it a hum like a transformer on a telephone pole, but coming from a throat. Another said it was a low sound, almost below hearing, that I felt more in my chest than my ears, quote unquote. The third A seasonal ranger with a background in music described it as a sustained tone, maybe G or A flat, below middle C, completely steady, lasting approximately 15 to 20 seconds. I have listened to every canid and ursid vocalization archived by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Nothing matches. 35 of my 41 sightings occurred between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. The remaining 6 took place during heavy overcast or in deep timber shade during daylight hours. Draw your own conclusions about what that means. I've drawn mine. Geographically, these sightings concentrate in 4 areas: Pelican Valley, Lamar Valley, Hayden Valley, and the Thoroughfare region in the park's southeast corner. These are the areas of highest wolfpack density in Yellowstone. They're also the areas most remote from roads and human development. The Thoroughfare, in particular, is often cited as the most remote point in the contiguous United States, more than 30 miles from the nearest road in any direction. If you wanted to conceal a population of large, intelligent animals in the lower 48, you would be hard-pressed to find better real estate. The park contains 2.2 million acres. Visitors, even in peak summer, confine themselves to approximately 1% of that acreage. What lives in the other 99% is, to a degree that would surprise most people, genuinely unknown. By 2011, I'd been doing this long enough to notice a change. The early accounts I collected had an almost accidental quality. People stumbled across something unexpected, reported it, and moved on. The encounters were brief. The witnesses were shaken but functional. Starting around 2011, the accounts began to shift. The encounters lasted longer. The creature's behavior appeared more deliberate, and the witnesses were harder to put back together afterward. I don't know if the creatures themselves were changing, or if I'd simply gotten better at finding the people who had the worst stories. I suspect both. Account 22. In July of 2013, a wildlife photographer I'll call Ben was on a multiple-day solo trip in Pelican Valley. He was an experienced backcountry traveler, mid-40s, and he'd been photographing Yellowstone grizzlies for a decade and a half. He knew how to hang food and manage bear encounters. This man knew how to control his heartbeat, even when something with claws was investigating his camp. He had done it before. He considered himself difficult to rattle. He awoke at 2 a.m. to the sound of something sniffing his tent. That in itself was unremarkable. Bears investigate tents. You lie still and you keep quiet, and they eventually lose interest. Ben knew the protocol, but the sniffing was different here. It was moving slowly and precisely along the seam where the rainfly met the tent body, tracking from the foot end toward the head end. It paused at his feet, and he could hear a deep, slow intake of breath through the nylon. Then it moved along his left side, up past his hip, past his ribs, and it stopped at his face. He was lying on his back. Whatever was outside the tent was inches from him, separated by the rainfly and the inner mesh. He could hear it breathing. He told me that the breathing was the thing that made him understand it was not a bear. It was too slow. A large animal, even at rest, breathes at a rate determined by its metabolic demand, and something the size of a grizzly takes a breath every 3 to 5 seconds. The breathing outside his tent came once every 15 to 20 seconds. Very long and slow inhalations, followed by long, slow exhalations, with pauses between each cycle that lasted longer than the breaths themselves. He said it sounded like something that didn't need much air. It stayed at his face for what he estimated to be 2 minutes. He could feel warmth through the fabric, he said, the body heat of something very large, very close. Then it moved on, continuing along the tent to the head end, and he heard footsteps walking away, 2-legged footsteps. He didn't leave his tent until sunrise. In the morning, he found claw marks on a lodgepole pine, approximately 6 feet from where his head had been. 5 evenly spaced gouges in the bark, at a height of approximately 8 feet above the ground. The gouges were deep enough that the white wood underneath the bark was exposed, and they were spaced in a pattern that I drove out to examine the following week. I brought a tape measure and a camera, and I spent an hour at that tree. I pressed my hand against the bark beside the marks. I have large hands. I wear an XL glove. The spread of the gouges was wider than my hand by at least 2 inches, and the pattern was consistent with 5 digits gripping and dragging downward, sort of how a person might run their fingernails down a surface. Once again, a comparison to people. But a person who left marks that deep in lodgepole bark would need claws at least 1.5 inches long and a grip strength that I do not think exists in human physiology. Ben packed up his camp that morning and hiked out. He canceled the remaining 4 days of his trip. I interviewed him 2 weeks later at a coffee shop in Jackson. He was calm and organized, and he answered every question I had. The only sign that anything was wrong was that he kept glancing at the window behind me, the one that faced the parking lot, where there was a tree line beyond it. Every time he glanced, I saw his jaw tighten up for just a moment before he would continue speaking. He told me he had not been back to Pelican Valley. When I asked if he planned to return, he picked up his coffee and put it down without drinking and said, "I've got plenty of other places to shoot." Account 27. In September of 2015, a backcountry ranger whose name I've agreed to withhold was conducting a solo patrol in the thoroughfare region along the upper Yellowstone River. He was 3 days into a 5-day loop. On the morning of the 3rd day, approximately 2 miles upstream from the thoroughfare patrol cabin, he came across a bull elk carcass. Elk predation in the thoroughfare is common, and an experienced ranger can read a carcass like a text. Wolves leave torn hide, scattered viscera, bones cracked for marrow. Grizzlies are tidier but still rough. What this ranger found fit neither pattern. The elk had been opened from the abdomen. The hide had been peeled back on both sides and folded. That was his word, like someone field dressing a deer. The organs had been removed completely. The body cavity was clean, with remarkably little blood on the surrounding ground. The ranger told me it looked like a surgical procedure performed in the field. Around the carcass he found tracks, the same anomalous canid prints I'd documented at Shoshone Lake in 2007, oversized, 4-toed with claw marks in a bipedal stride pattern. Whatever had dressed this elk had done so while walking on 2 legs. But the detail that has stayed with me the longest, the one I think about in that particular silence at 3 a.m. when my wife is asleep and the house settles and creaks, is the antlers. The bull's antlers had been removed. They had been cut from the pedicles, the bony base on the skull where the antlers attach. The ranger, who had multiple decades of field experience, had examined hundreds of elk skulls, told me the cut surfaces were smoother than anything teeth or claws could produce. He said they looked like they'd been cut with a tool. I asked what kind of tool could produce that result. He said he didn't know. I asked the same question of 2 veterinary forensic specialists at Montana State, presenting the photographs without context, telling them only that I was investigating an unusual elk mortality. Both said the cuts on the pedicles were consistent with a sharp, rigid implement. One of them asked if someone had used a bone saw. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A large bipedal canid that uses tools. I considered and rejected the possibility of a human poacher, because the tracks were canid, and because the area was days from the nearest road. Besides, no human has any reason to take the organs of a bull elk while leaving hundreds of pounds of edible meat untouched. I considered the possibility that the tracks and the carcass were unrelated. I still consider that possibility. It helps me sleep. Account 31. In November of 2017, a retired couple I'll call David and Margaret were driving out of the park at dusk along the road between Canyon Village and Norris Junction. Both were retired professors, geology and biology respectively, from a Midwest university that I will not name. They had been visiting the park for 30 years, and they knew the wildlife. Margaret was watching the meadows through Nikon 10x42 binoculars, when, at approximately 5:15 p.m., she picked up movement to their right. A large animal running parallel to the road, maybe 200 yards out. She identified it as a wolf, unusually large, moving at a full sprint. David was doing 45 miles per hour, but the animal was keeping pace. Margaret watched through binoculars for approximately 30 seconds, and then the animal changed. She said the front of the body lifted, the hind legs adjusted, the stride pattern shifted from a 4-beat gallop to a 2-beat run in a single fluid motion, and the creature continued along the meadow on 2 legs at the same speed. 45 miles per hour, on 2 legs. She told me the proportions during the transition were all wrong. The torso was elongated, or seemed to be. The forelimbs, which had been hitting the ground as forelegs, drew up against the chest and then hung at the sides. The head rotated from a forward-facing position to an upright one. She said the whole thing took maybe 3 seconds, and it was too fluid. And as you remember, that phrase or word usage was common among these witnesses. It's become something I dread. The more I heard it, the more I understood that fluid was frequently used to describe something that violates someone's understanding of things. The creature ran on 2 legs for another few hundred yards, still parallel to the road, and then veered into the trees. It was gone. David, who was driving, saw an animal moving into the timber. He did not see a transition. He glanced over at Margaret, and she was sitting very still with the binoculars in her lap. She didn't say anything. She didn't speak a word for the remainder of their 2-hour drive to Bozeman. Margaret told me this was the first time in their 40-year marriage that she had withheld something from her husband. She still had not told him what she saw. She said, "I know what tenure is supposed to protect, but not this." I thanked her and drove home. I pulled over twice on I-90 because my hands wouldn't stay steady on the wheel. I sat in a rest area near Livingston for 20 minutes with the engine idling and with the doors definitely locked. I was trying to reconcile what a credible PhD-holding field biologist had just told me with the world as I understood it. I could not reconcile them. By 2019, the year I retired from Fish and Wildlife, I had 34 accounts in my files, and I was sleeping badly. I'd started checking the deadbolt before bed, standing at the front door and turning the bolt, feeling its seat, something I had never imagined would be my routine. Some nights I would get up an hour later and check it again. My wife noticed, but didn't ask. I was still telling myself it was all academic. I was a collector of other people's encounters, stories, that the filing cabinet in my garage was a research project. I held on to that thought, like it was a handrail when the stairs were too slick and the light was too bad. As long as I was just the researcher, just the man with the tape recorder and the spreadsheet, I was safe from whatever was in those files. I was safe until September of 2022, because then I wasn't. What I think they are, and what I don't. The question I get from every person I've ever trusted enough to share this material with is the same. What are they? I'll tell you what I've ruled out first. The process of elimination is at least a road I know how to walk. They're not bears standing on hind legs. Bears don't walk bipedally for sustained distances, and they don't run at 45 miles per hour on 2 legs, and they certainly don't leave canid tracks. They're not mangy or disfigured wolves, because mangy wolves still look like wolves, still walk on 4 legs. They don't approach 7 feet in height. And I don't think they're humans in costumes, a suggestion that makes me tired. A human in a costume does not leave canid tracks with claw impressions, and again, they can't keep pace with highway traffic. A person with a suit is not going to survive winter temperatures of 30 and 40 below zero. They don't remove elk antlers on the spot with surgical precision using a tool that leaves no trace. Which brings me to the word I've been avoiding since the first page of this document, which 14 of my 41 witnesses used independently without any prompting from me. Werewolf. 14 professionals, spanning nearly 2 decades, reached for the same piece of folklore to describe what they saw. I find that fact uncomfortable, and I find it telling in equal measure. There is a history here, one that goes back further than my filing cabinet. The Shoshone, the Crow, and the Blackfoot all carry oral traditions that include beings described as both wolf and person. I mention this with the same caveat I offered earlier. These are spiritual and cultural concepts embedded in knowledge systems that predate European contact by thousands of years. They're not mine to interpret. I note them only because they exist and because they describe something that my witnesses, with their spotting scopes and GPS units and government-issued radios, also describe. The European record is thinner, but it's there. French-Canadian fur trappers working the northern Rockies in the 1820s and 1830s left journal entries that reference loup-garou in the mountains. Most of these are fragmentary and vague, easily dismissed as the superstitions of men living in isolation under extraordinary hardship. But one entry has always stayed with me. An 1836 letter from a fur trader operating out of Fort Hall, in what is now southeastern Idaho, to a business partner in St. Louis, contains the following passage. I have this fortnight past been troubled by a wolf that walked as a man, and looked upon me with knowing. It comes by night and stands at the edge of the firelight, and I have discharged my rifle at it twice, without apparent effect. I do not think it is a wolf. Now, I am a man who does not believe in the supernatural. I believe in species that have not yet been documented, and I believe the history of zoology is a long series of experts declaring things impossible right up until someone proves they exist. The mountain gorilla was a campfire story until 1902. The okapi was a myth until 1901. But I have to be honest with you. Those were animals that fit comfortably into known biological categories once they were discovered. What I'm describing does not have a fit. An animal that transitions between quadrupedal and bipedal locomotion, that appears to use tools, and demonstrates awareness of human observation technology, that watches specific humans with specific intent, that smells like copper and old death, and that can disappear behind a single tree in open forest. This is something else. I spend a lot of time in the early, dark morning hours thinking about this. Sometimes I almost convince myself it's all misidentification. Animals seen from bad angles and bad light by tired people running on adrenaline and coffee. I can nearly build a world where that's true. But then I think about those claw marks, 8 feet up a lodgepole, spread wider than my hand. And I think about the elk antlers cut with a tool. And about Carla, watching something look at her from 800 yards away, as if it recognized her. Then there's Pelican Valley. I wonder about what walked beside me through the burned timber on September 14th, 2022. And the doubt breaks apart, like ice on a river in spring. And I'm left with what I know. Let me tell you about Pelican Valley now. September 14th, 2022. That summer, I placed an unauthorized trail camera on a lodgepole pine near a thermal feature in Pelican Valley, approximately 2 miles from a site where 2 previous sightings had occurred. The camera was a Reconix Hyperfire 2 motion-activated infrared flash, bolted to the tree with a steel-mounting strap. It was a long shot, and I knew it was a long shot. But I'd been collecting other people's accounts for 18 years by then, and I'd run out of better ideas. I wanted my own evidence. I wanted something on a memory card that I could hold in my hand. I went in alone on the morning of September 14th to retrieve it. Pelican Valley is a bear management area with restricted access, and solo travel is discouraged. But bringing a partner would have meant explaining the camera, and explaining the camera would have meant explaining everything behind it. 20 years of secrecy is a kind of momentum. It carries you into decisions that look foolish from every angle, but you make them anyway. Otherwise, it means stopping, which means looking at what you've become. I parked at the Pelican Valley trailhead at 5:30 a.m. and I reached the camera site by 8 a.m. But the camera was gone from the tree. The steel mounting strap was still buckled around the trunk, cinched tight, exactly as I'd left it. The camera had been removed from inside the strap and placed on the ground approximately 3 feet from the base of the tree, face down in the dirt. The casing was intact. There were no tooth marks or claw marks, and I didn't see any sign of an impact. The SD card slot was open, and the SD card was missing. I sat on a fallen log and looked at the camera. The battery was still charged. The housing was undamaged. The only thing missing was that card, the only component that contained data. I listened to the hiss of thermal features and smelled the sulfur and felt the warmth of the ground through my boots. I knew something had found my camera and understood what it was, and they'd taken the only piece of it that held information. I put the camera in my pack, and I started the hike out. The first 2 miles were unremarkable, just open meadow and willow flats with good visibility. Then the trail enters a corridor of burned lodgepole pine, a remnant of the 1988 fires. The dead trunks stand close together, gray and branchless, like fence posts, stretching in every direction. The sight lines are long, hundreds of yards, because there's nothing green to block the view. You can see everything. That's what I told myself as I entered the burned timber. At approximately mile 3 of the return, I became aware of a sound to my left and slightly behind me. Footsteps, 2-legged footsteps, matching my pace. I stopped walking. The footsteps stopped too, but they took one additional step after I halted. An echo stops simultaneously. An animal reacting to your stop would show a delay of a half-second or more, the lag between stimulus and response. This extra step was something else. It was almost synchronized, off by a fraction of a beat, as if the thing walking beside me was making a decision to stop, and that decision arrived 1 footfall too late. I started to walk again. The footsteps resumed. I walked faster. They adjusted. I slowed down, and they adjusted again, always with that fractional delay, that tiny gap between my change and its response, like a mirror image running a half-second behind. I would hear the footfalls clearly in the silence of the burned timber. They were heavy. They were bipedal. They were approximately 40 yards to my left, somewhere in the columns of gray dead wood, and I could not see what was making them. I didn't turn to look. When you encounter a predator in the wild, the dynamic of the encounter is shaped by acknowledgement. As long as neither party signals awareness of the other, you are just 2 animals occupying the same space. You are parallel. But the moment you turn and look, you create a relationship. You become the observed and the observer, the prey and the predator, the thing that runs and the thing that chases. I knew this in my training, and I knew it in my bones. I did not turn to look. I walked through that burned timber for approximately 20 minutes while something paced me through the dead trees, 40 yards to my left, matching every variation in my speed with that terrible half-second delay. I stared straight ahead. I kept my breathing even. I counted my steps, because counting at least gave me something to do with the part of my brain that wanted to scream. I made it to 642. The corridor of burned lodgepole opened into a meadow. The moment I stepped from dead timber into open grass, the footsteps stopped. Whatever had been walking beside me stopped at the tree line, which reminded me of a person stopping at the edge of a swimming pool, right at the boundary between one thing and another. I walked 50 yards into the meadow. I stopped then, and I turned around. The burned trees stood in their rows, gray and vertical, backlit by the overcast sky. For a moment, I saw nothing. But then I found it. It was standing behind a trunk, partially concealed, visible from approximately the rib cage up, gray-brown, and motionless. The trunk was maybe 10 inches in diameter, and the body on either side of it was wider than the trunk by a considerable margin. But it stood there behind that tree, like a child hiding behind a telephone pole, as if the act of placing something between us was the point at all, as if concealment was a gesture, not the tactic. The head was above the fracture point where the trunk had snapped off, a horizontal break in the dead wood that I returned to measure 3 weeks later. The break was at 8 feet and 2 inches. The top of the skull cleared it. I could not make out features at that distance. What I could see was the color, gray-brown like dead wood and winter grass, and the shape, which was broader in the shoulders than anything I've seen in 40 years of fieldwork. And the eyes. I told you earlier that I've looked into the eyes of grizzlies and mountain lions, but I was not prepared for this. The eyes of a predator contain something recognizable. They contain animal intelligence, that calculating awareness of a creature deciding whether you are food, a threat, or simply irrelevant. What looked at me from behind that tree was not the same kind of thing. The eyes caught the daylight and reflected it back in a flat, pale wash, the color of dirty ice, and behind that reflection there was something I could not read at all. I do not mean it was hostile or curious. I mean I could not tell what it was, and the impossibility of reading those eyes was the worst thing I'd ever felt. I looked at it, and it looked at me. I would like to say this lasted 2 minutes. It would make the encounter more credible, but I simply don't know. Time does strange things when you're standing in an open meadow while something that should not exist studies you from behind a dead tree. It stepped to its right, behind the trunk, and it was gone. Again, these were branchless lodgepole pines with clear sightlines for hundreds of yards. There was nowhere to go behind the tree that I should not have been able to see. It stepped behind 10 inches of dead wood, and it was gone somehow, like the tree was a door, and it had stepped through it into somewhere else. I walked the remaining 4 miles to the trailhead as fast as I could, checking behind me every 30 seconds. I made it to my truck and locked the doors. I drove home, went inside, and kissed my wife hard. I returned to the site 3 weeks later with a colleague who agreed to come out without asking too many questions. We found nothing. The weather had turned and the first hard frost had baked the soil. My SD card was never found. I have 7 new reports since September 2022. The witnesses continue to be credible, reluctant, and frightened, and I continued to record their accounts on the same Olympus recorder I bought in 2009. I continue to file the transcripts in the cabinet in my garage. My wife and I have always slept with the bedroom window open. Even in January, when the temperature in Gardner drops to 20 below and frost builds on the inside of the glass, we cracked that window 2 inches because we liked the cold air and the sound of the Yellowstone River, which you can hear from our house if the wind is right. We've done this for the entire 30 years we've lived in that house. However, since September 2022, I keep the window closed. My wife saw the look on my face when I shut it the first time, and she knew why without asking. Our house in Gardner sits 5 miles from the north boundary of Yellowstone National Park. I used to think 5 miles was a comfortable distance. Lately, though, I find myself wondering why I ever assumed they would stop at that boundary. I have no evidence that they do. In 20 years of collecting these accounts, in 41 reports from trained observers across 2.2 million acres of wilderness, I found nothing to suggest that whatever lives in that park respects the lines we've drawn on our maps. 5 miles is nothing to something that can keep pace with a car. Werewolves are so scary, they don't even have to be actively tearing chunks out of your body to be intimidating. Things shouldn't walk like people, and they shouldn't be watching you in the woods. Combine both those acts, and you've got the world's most disturbing stalker. Good night. Thank you all so much for tuning in to this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails, and you can find me on my other show, Unexplained Encounters, if you want more stories like this about encounters with the unknown and terrifying. You can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Till next time, everyone, make sure you follow and review this show on Spotify and Apple to help us grow. And I'll be clocking out. Don't worry, I'll be back again real soon.